Hello and welcome to Roundtable. Why does the European Union appear to have gone, if not cold, then a little chilly about inviting 6 Balkan countries to the bloc? Well, it appears the big fear is that since membership comes with the free movement of people, there will be a lot of people in countries that already belong worried about migration. Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, Kosovo, Bosnia and North Macedonia have been on the waiting lists for almost 20 years. Now they've been told that one day they will be welcome, but not when that day will be. Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. As some kind of sweetener, they're being offered 9 billion euros in investment. But there are concerns that that will not be enough to keep them from forging closer ties with Russia, China, and other countries. And as we'll see now, they're not very happy with the EU prevarication. This is from Serbia. All these years and even decades we've been listening about the membership promises from the EU. The question is, which generation will see those promises being fulfilled? Why don't they simply tell us we no longer want EU expansion and we will accept it as a reality? North Macedonia. We took all necessary steps and we made all required reforms. We'll take the additional acceptable steps to unlock EU enlargement and expect that Bulgaria will unlock this process. And Albania, that actually is holding us hostage at a time when we have fulfilled all our tasks and wait to sit around the table with the European Union to kick off negotiations. Well, we heard what they had to say. Let's hear from our guests now. Joining us from Gračanica in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have Adnan Cerimagic, a senior analyst for the Western Balkans at the European Stability Initiative. We welcome back, she happens to be in Berlin, Engjellushe Morina, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and Ian Bancroft, a consultant for the Peaceful Change Initiative and the author of Dragon's Teeth, Tales from North Kosovo. Well, he is in Belgrade. Thank you. Adnan, let me come to you. So we heard from Serbia, we heard from North Macedonia, we heard from Albania. What is the feeling in Bosnia and Herzegovina?
Well, let me continue from Serbia, but from the perspective of Bosnia and Herzegovina. For stability and the perspective of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia is key because we know that the source of instability that we have seen in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1990s has come from Serbia. So after 10 to 15 years of EU having a policy, having a strategy, having an impact on Belgrade, from giving away war criminals to making a concrete step towards showing that it respects Bosnia and Herzegovina and Dayton Peace Accords, we're at the moment where EU no longer has a strategy towards the region, so also towards Serbia, where Serbian authorities, ministers, and politicians in the parliament are talking with a narrative that resembles that of 1980s and 1990s, and where we hear more and more people speaking about border changes, about fluidity of Bosnia and Herzegovina as a state. So there is I would say, a fear in Bosnia and Herzegovina that without the EU offer to Serbia and to the region, influence of EU is no longer to be seen, and that for some it's a matter of time when Serbia and will move towards Bosnia and Herzegovina, so to say.
Okay, so you believe that the European Union, by doing this or by not doing this, if you like, is risking stability in an already unstable region?
We can already see that from Kosovo-Serbia border at the moment to Bosnia and Herzegovina. EU's credibility and ability to have impact in the countries is no longer there. We're not speaking anymore about transformation, about getting these countries into shape to become members of the EU. EU at the moment is trying to negotiate some kind of deals that would prevent conflict. And it's just a matter of time without a concrete strategy and policy where not even that will be possible.
Engjellushe, you happen to be in Berlin, but Kosovo's your home country. I would ask you the opinion of people there, and also to comment on what you've heard from Adnan about increased instability.
Yes. So in all the polls, recent polls, the recent years, the polls, Kosovars are the most pro-European people in the Balkans. And I think they remain so. I mean, most of the immigration most Kosovars dream to end up either in Germany or Switzerland. There is a huge diaspora. There are very strong links. But in terms of EU enlargement process, Kosovo feels that it has been failed drastically by EU. It still is not recognized by all EU members. There are 5 members who don't recognize Kosovo. Visa liberalization has been promised, and Kosovars have fulfilled all the continuous update of the list of conditions, and still visa liberalization is not there. The process, negotiated process facilitated by EU to overcome the dispute with Serbia is also has been problematic for many years. It has been going on forever. It's dragging. There are no developments there. And in recent months, just as Adi mentioned, Serbia has reacted overreacted over issues such as small plates and over issues such as fighting corruption and organized crime by the Kosovo police.
Will this lessen support within Kosovo for EU institutions and trust in that organization?
I think it's evident that the support is kind of fading away, but I think Kosovars don't see another alternative. So there's no huge China influence or a Russia influence in Kosovo. Kosovars only talk about Euro-Atlantic integration. They want to get into EU and they want to get into NATO. And Kosovars are also very pro-US for many reasons. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's fading because there is no alternative in the perception of Kosovars, but it's hugely disappointing, especially to young people. And you see these complaints very often when, for example, a young person wants to either travel abroad or study abroad. They have to, first of all, pile huge, layers of documents and then wait for many months to get a 5-day visa to Europe. And you hear all these complaints that what is a European, what does it mean for a Kosovar to have a European perspective when it's actually not there?
Okay, thank you very much. Ian, I'm going to come to you. You're in Belgrade. You know what the Serbians think. Your organization's calls for peaceful change. Is this decision likely to make that less likely, peaceful change?
Well, when you refer to the dialogue process that the previous speaker just mentioned, I mean, this has been driven by the EU and by the potential of EU membership. With the loss of that shared perspective or the dilution of that shared perspective, then there are definitely concerns that the tensions will reignite, because even 20 years on from the end of the war in Kosovo, 25, almost 30 years on from the end of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there are still so many unresolved issues pertaining to status, pertaining to sovereignty, denials of war crimes, of genocide, etc. I mean, the lack of progress is really quite striking, and to lose that perspective of EU membership is to really undermine those who have striven for this reform for decades, and many of them are now choosing to leave. If you look at the demographics in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Serbia, you have small towns, the equivalent of small towns vanishing every 6 months or so. There are real tangible consequences on the ground of this loss of perspective.
So what do you make of the EU's decision to put perhaps on one side of the scales the problems it sees of migration and of financial instability of bringing in new poorer countries into the bloc versus the problems this might create in a region that has seen so much bloodshed within the last 25 years?
I think the two things have to happen simultaneously. We need to see reform of the EU internally with respect to its decision-making structures, for instance. I mean, you can't have 6 Western Balkan countries join and have 6 more commissioners. You can't have 6 new de facto veto holders. I mean, these things need to change in the coming years. But that doesn't mean that the process of EU enlargement can't continue at the same time. As I said, many thousands of young people, thousands of families are departing the Western Balkans each year anyway. So the demographic question is one of the tangible consequences of this loss of perspective. And I think it's in the EU's interest, if it wants to demonstrate its capability to be a transformative power. If it can't transform the Western Balkans, then what hope is there for transforming anywhere else, even in its eastern neighborhood, let alone further beyond in North Africa or the Middle East? I mean, this really is the test case for the EU. It's invested huge amounts of financial resources, arguably for which it doesn't get due credit for, and it's invested huge amounts of capital, political capital. I think there are many, and this goes back to I think some of the point that Adnan was making. There are some very perverse incentives now for politicians in the region, and I've seen it in Serbia, where Serbia has been rewarded at times for progress, not on things related to the acquis, but on progress vis-a-vis Kosovo. And so there's a perverse incentive almost to create this destabilization, because then you can come and be the firefighter, get political credence in Brussels and other EU capitals, and move on without having undertaken the fundamental reforms that are actually required as part of the EU accession process.
I don't know who to put this one to. We'll see all three of you on the screen, so you can choose who's going to be the spokesman. But my question really is, do you think fears about migration, do you think fears about the financial burdens of some of the new Balkans countries, if they joined, are sufficient in the EU's mind to say, no, not for the time being at all, given what you've said might be the consequences of that? Anybody? Adnan.
I can jump in. I don't think it's a matter of if it is sufficient or not. For some of the politicians that hold the key of saying yes, for example, to opening accession talks with Albania or North Macedonia, it's sufficient. So we need to treat it like that. We need to, EU 27 need to find a strategy and a policy that all 27 can agree on, because what we know is that all 27 of them support future perspective for the Western Balkans, that they become members of the EU, as Ian said, one day when EU is internally reformed and when there is no fear that they will endanger the functioning of the EU. But in the meantime, we see throughout the Western Balkans that we can't wait for that moment. We need some kind of a process as an interim step or in the meantime. So going back to 1990s and how it worked with Sweden or Austria when they were first offered a membership in the single market is something that the EU 27 really need to consider seriously as an interim step for the Western Balkans that will not just be attractive enough for reformers in the region, but that will make the region in a perspective of 5 to 7 years more attractive for the EU members and for those who are skeptics inside the EU members.
You see, there was Ian, sorry to interrupt, there was Ian saying, yes, there need to be reforms within the European Union itself. But what about, Engjellushe, you can come in on this if you like, what about reforms within the 6 Western Balkan countries themselves? Because there are concerns about corruption, about the adherence to the rule of law, about the financial insolvency in some cases. What do they need to do to change that?
No, I think I agree that there has to be internal reforms into the EU, but also more reforms in the 6 Balkan countries. We have to also be a bit fair and mention that there has been progress, especially if we compare it to 15 years ago. There has been progress in many fields, but of course a lot more has to be done, and especially on the issues of fighting organized crime and corruption, and on the issues of economic development. But I would also say that wouldn't be enough if if we see at the same time nationalist rhetorics in some of the Balkan countries and nationalism rising, and this nationalist populism, if I would say, and the narratives that we have been seeing in recent months and maybe years. So I think these are also the things that have to be addressed by the EU, not just the reforms, because obviously just focusing on the reforms is not enough. There is also this other problem that I think EU is lacking strategic thinking on how to deal with. And
is an example of that lack of strategic thinking deciding not to do this at the moment, to sort of say, well, one day we will, because of the difficulties that could cause, as you suggest, perhaps in the rise of nationalism?
I think, I mean, this has tested before when the problem of dissolution of ex-Yugoslavia was kind of attempted to be pushed away, and then we all know what happened, and it was far too late when the international intervention came in. So I think this is where a lot more strategic thinking has to go in, because the time actually was yesterday to do something more in the Balkans, and I think we don't have time to lose, and and then get into the crisis management, and we have come close to that, I think, in the Balkans.
Ian, do you want to handle this one? I mean, one of the reasons I've read for the reluctance of some EU countries, perhaps France, perhaps the Netherlands, Denmark, to back EU accession for these countries is the examples of Bulgaria and Romania. Now, would you care to enlighten our audience what those issues were?
Well, I think there was a sense that Bulgaria and Romania had joined prematurely in the sense of the sustainability of the rule of law reforms that they'd made, and the whether corruption, organized crime, etc., had really been fundamentally tackled. But I think the Western Balkan Six already face a stricter criteria in that domain anyway. The freedom of movement point keeps coming up. I mean, and it is apt and it is politically relevant given the state of politics in Western Europe. But to use the Bulgarian Romania example, they both faced transitional measures when they joined. Their labor was not entitled immediately to come freely and work in Western European countries. I think it was 7 years that those measures were in place. So, even if the Western Balkan Six joined in 2030, transitional measures built in would mean that those from the six countries would not enjoy the right to move freely.
Well, with Bulgaria and Romania, have they been able to institute the required reforms, at least to some extent, within the bloc, rather than having to wait until they've done that before they join? Have they made those changes?
Well, it's not just Bulgaria and Romania. I think we look at Poland and Hungary. These are the more, illiberal and state-captured examples that are now directly confronting the very fundamentals of the European Union itself. So even instances that were celebrated at one juncture are now backsliding at a remarkable pace. And what signal does this send to the Western Balkan Six when, within the Union they can't even hold such countries to the standards that are demanded, that are at the heart of this project? So it remains to be seen. I mean, this is a very stringent challenge for the EU. The steps taken by Poland, by Hungary. I think the Bulgaria-Romania issues are far less importance these days.
Okay, well, we have been over those in many other programs here on Roundtable, Poland, Hungary, etc., etc. I'd like to concentrate on the Balkan Six, if I can, and I want to play this clip now from the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen.
First of all, the Western Balkan is part of the same Europe as the European Union. We share the same history, we share the same interests, the same values, and I'm deeply convinced also the same destiny. And the European Union is not complete without the Western Balkans. So my Commission will continue to do its utmost to advance the enlargement process and the region's EU integration. We want the Western Balkans in the European Union. There cannot be any doubt that our goal is enlargement.
Adnan, is she therefore suggesting that we've got to keep you close because we're worried if we don't, you may go elsewhere, you may go to China, to Russia, to other countries?
Well, I think what she's trying to say is very correct, and that is that if the EU if the EU works in its own interest, then Western Balkans need to be deeply integrated and offered a full membership in the EU. Where I think that the words coming from the President of the Commission are misleading is how fast that can happen, and it doesn't take into account challenges the Commission and the Western Balkans face with some of the EU member states when it comes to how quickly that can happen and whether that can happen through the process that we're used to, the process where you have a candidate status, accession talks, chapters, clusters, etc.
Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the point I'm trying to drive at is what happens now. Will those countries be within the orbit of other more powerful influences than they are perhaps at the moment? Will we see the Russians, the Chinese, indeed other countries step in and try to take advantage of this?
Well, what I can see at the moment in the region, especially in Serbia, but also in some other countries, is the return to the nationalistic and ethnic narratives and politics. And we can see that Russia and to some part China is using that to actually rub it through the nose of the EU and the lack of policy and strategy towards the region. So we can already see that, you know, words by the President of the European Commission are not enough, because what happens on the ground is not what one would expect it would happen from such a strong words about the future of the Western Balkans inside the EU. So the weakness of the EU strategy and policy, lack of realism in Brussels in particular towards it, is visible in the region and with regards to the third actors as well.
Ian, I mentioned the 9 billion euros that the European Union has said it will push into the Western Balkans, but there are concerns that the people of those countries won't see very much of it themselves, that it will disappear because of the corruption that there is in these countries, which could make it more likely that the people themselves, as well as perhaps the governments, want to drift away from an organisation which, although it's handed out masses of money, hasn't been seen to arrive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, often the EU doesn't get credit for giving money to the Western Balkan Six. If you look in Serbia, a loan from the Russians is celebrated with more champagne and more fireworks than a grant from the EU. The EU is not very good at communicating just what it contributes. And certainly the nature of state capture, particularly in places like Serbia, in Montenegro, raises fundamental questions about how that money will be used. Will it go to the intended purposes? Is there sufficient robust EU oversight in place to ensure that happens? Is the EU willing to speak out publicly if that happens? I remain very, very skeptical. It's one thing to have, raise some black marks or wag your finger behind closed doors, but I think, sometimes public expressions of such doubts need to be voiced. And certainly we can see the presence of, Serbia is getting infrastructure funded and constructed by the Chinese on favorable loans with a lack of transparency as to the contractual terms, the obligations, the liabilities. And this is very tempting for domestic politicians. You can show off a new highway, a new bridge, and a lot of what is being procured is being done in a manner that would not conform with standard EU public procurement practices. So the ability of third parties to stamp their authority, their presence. I mean, in Bosnia, the influence that Russia has on Republika Srpska and the ability to obstruct and even threaten to pull out of state-level institutions is really, adding further strain on the country. So again, this is having tangible consequences. It's not just a vow of allegiance or that, a voicing that there are alternatives, but it does have tangible consequences on the ground.
Okay, Engjellushe, you may want to add other countries to the Russia-China list, those that are vying for influence in this area. But I want to try and sum up your thoughts on whether the EU has made a big mistake here.
In allowing the void to be filled in by external actors.
Well, I suppose that's one element of it, but by deciding to push this whole idea down the road for the foreseeable future.
I think so. I think it is a mistake, and I think we already see the effects of it. I mean, there are already many statements, as you mentioned at the beginning of the program, coming out of the Balkan countries. But let me say, I still believe that EU remains attractive, although it has lost a bit of the the strategic thinking on how to continue to be a transformative power. But it's still an attractive idea, if I could say, an attractive ambition for many of the Western Balkans people. But it's something that China and Russia will never be able to substitute. Just an example, even we hear constantly that Serbs are pro-Russian. At the end of the day, many young Serbs want to go and study abroad. To Europe and to United States, and they speak fluently English. They don't speak fluent Chinese. I mean, this is very rare. So just an example. But whether EU is making mistakes into not using its leverage, for example, yes, and there are instruments. I just like to add to what Ian was saying. There are instruments where EU could get involved more into looking closely into how all these funds are being used. There are anti-corruption measures that could be used more. There is the Office of Public Prosecutor that could be used more and more in some of these countries where it's not very clear how the funds are being spent, but this is not happening. So the leverage, there is potential leverage still within the EU, but it's not being used properly.
Well, the consequences of that and the decision to push EU accession and eventually membership down the road, we will have to wait and see what they are. Thank you very much indeed, Adnan. Much appreciated to have you on the program. Engjellushe, lovely to see you once again. And Ian, thank you very much indeed. We thank you wherever you happen to be watching this edition of Roundtable. We hope you found it informative. From me, David Foster, from the Roundtable team, until next time, goodbye.